just reiterate, because there's a few more people that have joined since Steve spoke. I just ask that if you have any questions, please save them to the end or type them into your box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll pick up those and ask those questions to John at the end of the presentation. So welcome, John, and thank you very much for being part of this webinar, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Brett, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for taking some time out of your busy day to listen to little old me. Now, at times like this, it's quite difficult not to see myself as a slightly terrified Pom walking out to bat at the Adelaide Oval. Now, I don't think Mitchell Johnson is on the list of attendees today. If he is, then I'm leaving straight away. Now, just something for you. This is very clever software, and I can actually see if you get a bit bored and start doing something else. So just so you know that, I thought I'd get that in there. Okay, so what are we going to do? What are we going to do today? We're going to have a look at how to write an abstract for a conference. I'm certainly not a world authority on this, but I've written a few, so I think I've got some idea what the organising committees are looking for. And as Brett said, I'm on the committee for the Infection Prevention and Control IPS meeting, which is the sort of UK equivalent of the college, I think. And also do some editing for the Journal of Hospital Infection. And these are my disclosures, which I think Brett mentioned in the introduction. So let's begin with an overview. I'm sort of assuming that actually the planning and the work itself has been done, and we're now at a stage where we're looking at writing it up for a conference. Now, why would you do that? Why not just skip the conference and go straight to getting it in the peer-reviewed literature, which is where it hopefully will be destined for ultimately? There's some really interesting discussion right now in the PLOS journal about how poster sessions particularly, and submitted science generally, is the lifeblood of these conferences. Hearing professors pontificating from the platform about their grand research is great, but actually the nuts and bolts of what happens in the field is in the poster hall. So I'm really passionate about submitted science to conferences, and I think without it we'd lose an awful lot. So we'll look at how to prepare an abstract and do everything we can to maximise the chances of the work being accepted for publication at the conference. We'll then look at some tips for the actual presentation itself, whether that be by a poster or an oral presentation. I'm assuming there'll be a little bit of work to finish, and then it'll come to writing the paper up for a peer-reviewed journal. So, why publish your work at all? Well, it's important to prevent reinvention of the wheel. If we're all doing the same thing in our own little silos and not talking to each other, and that can be the hospital next door, it can be the continent next door, then that's not very useful. We need to share practice, particularly in this digital age where we can share our learning so easily relative to the good old days. I think the status quo is often wrong and quite often needs challenging. Quality improvement is increasingly important. I think an abstracted conference gives you a facility to share that quality improvement initiative that has been successful. It's also good for you as a professional to develop your professional skills in terms of analysing the science and presenting the science and gathering feedback from that. And it may or may not be a requirement of your clinical or academic role. So let's begin with the preparation of the abstract, and this will really be the meat of the webinar today. What to publish? If you're sitting there thinking, well, the deadline for this conference is mid-August, have I actually done anything that could be submitted as a conference abstract? The answer is almost certainly yes. So something that's important to practice or service delivery, something new, innovative, that's transferable and relevant and accessible. That's what you're looking for. It doesn't have to be a multi-center randomized controlled trial, although if you've done one, then you should probably submit it. It can be something as simple as a really well-formulated and slightly unusual hand hygiene campaign that's really influenced the service delivery in your hospital. And so to the hurdles. And it can seem a bit daunting at first if you've never submitted an abstract before. Where do you start? And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll be in a better place to start. So the hurdles. I think before you actually get to even putting pen to paper, so to speak, there needs to be a bit of work up front to tick off the ethics, the conflicts of interest, and the authorship. And then you can get to the abstract itself in terms of the format, the structure, and the content. So let's begin with the ethics. The world is not what it once was. Back in the day, you could do pretty horrible things to prisoners, for example, and nobody really batted an eyelid. The world has moved on and moved in a good direction, I think, so that research, medical research is much more tightly regulated than it was before. And you're asked to adhere to ethics guidelines for pretty much all submissions to all conferences. It can go too far. There was a fabulous study published in the year 2000 now, it's quite some time ago, and they did a really neat exercise where they got some cauliflower DNA and they put it on a telephone in a neonatal intensive care unit and watched how quickly that cauliflower DNA spread around the ward. They wanted to do some follow-up work to this, but they fell foul of the ethical submission, who were a little concerned that the children may somehow recombine with this cauliflower DNA and incorporate it into their genome. Now, it seems pretty unlikely, and that's ethics gone mad, but in general, the ethical standards to which we have to adhere nowadays are a good thing, and it's something to be aware of. And if you're not sure, seek advice, and I'm sure there will be somebody in your institution who's done it before and negotiated the ethics requirements. Conflicts of interest are important to declare. So a conflict of interest exists when a person has an affiliation that's not obvious to the reader that may affect their impartiality. The rule is always declare it. If the work has links to industry, that's fine, provided the work was performed impartially. And if you're not sure whether you have a conflict, seek advice from the conference before submission. And it's absolutely true that transparency is better than embarrassment. It's better to overdo declaration of conflicts rather than underdo it. That's the general rule. What about authorship? It's a really much discussed topic of what constitutes authorship of a scientific publication, be it an abstract for a conference or a paper. And I think the standards of what qualifies you to be an author should be the same. Being part of a research group doesn't de facto make you eligible to have your name on that piece of work. It shouldn't work like that, although often it does in the real world. So it should be based on people who have contributed not only to the performing the work itself, but the conception and the design, the drafting of the science and the analysis of the data, and also final approval is necessary from all authors. And you can see some more details on this from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, who've got some guidelines on what constitutes authorship. And then we come to the abstract itself. All different conferences will have different suggestions on what format you should go for. They'll have different structures. IMRD is Introduction, Methods, Results and Discussion, which is a fairly standard method for scientific conferences, but by no means the only method. There will be a word count of some kind that you'll need to keep to. Some house style requirements in terms of fonts and spacing, referencing maybe less relevant for abstracts because you don't normally put references in abstracts because the word counts are so tight. And you need to know what you're doing, read the guidelines carefully, and also abstracts will be pinged, particularly from larger conferences, if your abstract doesn't meet the format. So even if you've got the best science in the world, if you haven't read the formatting guidelines properly, then you may find your abstract rejected just based on format, which would be really disappointing. And then to the title. Now the title is the thing that most people will read, and it may be the only thing that people read, particularly if it's not got a hook to it and it doesn't draw the reader in. So keep it short is a good rule. 10 to 15 words max. Try to get keywords in the title so that people can sort of key in to what the abstract is going to be about. And then there's a balance between being interesting and creative to draw the reader in, but then if you tip the balance, you become obscure, nobody knows what you're talking about, and it hasn't worked as a title. Now I thought I'd illustrate with some examples, and this is just my opinion, and this is a very much a subjective thing. Some people like very straight titles, other people like very quirky titles, and some people are kind of in between. But these are some titles from abstracts from a conference in the UK last year, and I like the first top left one. To erg is human, exploring inherent and elective hand hygiene triggers, a pilot study in the NHS. You've got a little quip there to pull you in, and then more detailed description about what the abstract is about. The not so good one, my only problem is it's too long. It's a very long sentence. They could definitely have cut that down. Similarly, a handle on infection, novel technology to improve hand hygiene in healthcare settings. Again, it's quite clever, and it also is informative. Whereas MRSA, the battle is on, I have no idea what the abstract's going to say. It could be saying all sorts of different things. Is our current cleaning method effective against C. diff? Okay, it's not the most creative title in the world, but it certainly tells you what it is, and it's succinct. Whereas infection control audit in a tertiary referral elective hospital, that could be anything. What are you auditing? You have no idea. So it's that balance between grabbing a reader's attention and being informative, and that can sometimes be tricky. So structure. It's definitely worth taking a bit of time and having a think about the appropriate structure for the abstract. Is it a scientific piece of work? So have you got a clear introduction, methods, results, and discussion? Or is it something like a quality improvement exercise where that introduction, methods, results, and discussion format wouldn't work so well? Is it something different, like a systematic review, in which case you need to have a different structure for that? I think there's a good analogy between the structure of an abstract and indeed a scientific paper and a sat-nav. It should effortlessly, without you really thinking about it, lead you through the paper. And as you can see there, it's not easy to get the structure right, and it will take a bit of time and experience. But if done right, a good structure can really help. And so, to the introduction, I think in general, you want to give a little bit of background, you want to give a little bit of context, but especially for an abstract, keep it short and keep it succinct. The methods is simply really you trying to the best of your ability to explain what you did and how you did it. And obviously, depending on which piece of work you've done, the specific methods will vary. But very often there will be an intervention of some kind, and I think the appropriate statistics is something that is really important, increasingly so, as access to statistical packages becomes much more readily available. I think there's an increasing expectation that appropriate stats are performed. You can't do it yourself often. You very, very often need some input from expert epidemiologists and statisticians to let you know what the appropriate sample size is and statistical methods in order to determine whether you can actually answer the question you're trying to answer. Results, especially for an abstract, you can't put everything in there. You just run out of words, and if you try, it'll become cluttered and unreadable. So you need to make some judgments about what is relevant and what is a fair representation of the entire data set you have. Try and include some sort of descriptive or statistical data if that's available, or themes and categories if not. It's good to try and include tables and figures if they're permissible in the conference you're going for. And on that line, pictures and graphs can paint 1,000 words. And the discussion is key. I think it's possibly the most important part of the abstract, because if you over-egg the outcomes and try and over-claim based on whatever results you have, then you'll find that your abstract will not be accepted. It's good to have a balanced view of your own work, to look at the strengths and the weaknesses, and maybe just think about how it can be improved. And if you have space, look at further research priorities also. So, what to do and what not to do when you're writing your abstract. Definitely think hard about having an interesting and creative title. It's the hook that pulls the readers in. Spelling and grammar is absolutely crucial, and it's unforgivable really nowadays to have an obvious typo that's not a scientific word, because you should have spell checked it. So it just has to be done. Short words, short sentences, and short paragraphs is definitely easier to digest than very long, very detailed sentences. Plain English, as plain as you can. A really good idea, and this comes highly recommended, is to take your abstract and run it by some colleagues who have not been directly involved in what you're doing, because if they don't understand your abstract, then the readers won't either. Try to avoid having an obscure title. I like something that's interesting, creative, but if it becomes obscure, it's not doing its job. Try not to use jargon or abbreviations, and slang and cliche, you can get away with a bit, but not too much. And spelling and grammar is unforgivable, really. So once you've submitted your abstract, what will happen? Now, the actual procedure for managing the submitted abstract will be different depending on which conference you're going for. But in general, the abstracts will undergo some sort of peer review process, which is usually blinded. And that means that the people looking at the abstracts don't know who it's from. So they're not biased by that if they don't like you, or if they do like you. It shouldn't affect what they say about your abstract, because they don't know who it's from. A small proportion of the abstract will be selected as oral presentations, and they're normally sort of the blue ribbon best research. Although that's not always the case. Quite often abstracts are chosen as oral presentations to fit into programs and themes. So the majority of the abstracts will be presented as posters. A small number will be rejected. At the IPS, we do try and give some feedback as to why they were rejected. I'm not sure whether the college can do that, and it will depend on how many you've got. As submissions increase, that kind of tailored individual service becomes untenable, really. So this is the grading chart that we use in the IPS to try and assess the abstracts, and underneath this there's a whole document expanding upon this, but this is the summary really, to look at the various elements of the abstract that we're assessing, to grade it as a wonderful, outstanding, good, average, or poor. So in terms of rationale, you want to know exactly why they did what they did, and to make sure that the rationale isn't flawed. It's great if it's original and novel. It's not so good if it's derivatory and been done before many, many times. The methods need to be really tight and rigorous so that you can know exactly what was done. The data analysis needs to be appropriate, of course, with statistics where appropriate. And then, of course, the results and the conclusions. What does this mean to practice? Is it going to change practice, or is it really not going to make any difference at all? Or it might actually have the opposite effect if the claims are too great for the data. So you have your abstract. Your abstract is accepted. Hooray. What next? You get the opportunity to present your poster or your oral presentation. So what makes a good poster? Well, it wouldn't look a lot like this because it's got too much text and nothing graphical. So a good poster for me, and I admit that this is quite a personal thing. Some people like to have lots of text and lots of detail on the poster so that they can really go and forensically analyze the real details of what was done. For me, when I'm walking around the conference hall, I don't really have time for that. I'll sort of wait until the paper comes out. If I'm really interested, I'll speak to the presenter. I want something that grabs my attention and says, come and look at me, that's graphical and not text-based. It's not cluttered. There's a good use of color. It's not gaudy, but it's not boring. You can clearly see where you're going around the poster. The navigation is obvious. And the key findings are right there to be seen. They hit you between the eyes. This is what we did and this is what we found. Then there should be more detailed information somewhere for those that want to find it. This may seem like a silly point, but it should be the correct size for the board. So many times you see rather embarrassed poster presenters with a poster that's landscape that should be portrait, or portrait that should be landscape, or it's too big or it's too small, and it just doesn't really work, and it's quite simple to fix by just checking the guidelines. It's not necessary. You can't fit all of your data on the poster. You need to be selective. Look out for low-res graphics, because it can look very good on your computer, and then it's blown up to full size, and even the logo of your hospital has gone all fuzzy. So these are some examples of some quite good posters, I think, from previous years. The one on the right in particular, I think it's got a nice look to it. It's obviously, they thought carefully about the design of it. There's not too much text, although it's fairly text-heavy, and they've got some sensible images. The one on the left was actually an award winner several years ago. It's not great visually, and I think it won the award mainly for the science than for the visual aspect, but it's okay. I'm sure you can come up with some much more creative ones. There are some poster templates available on the IPS website that may be of use, although the size and the shape may all be different to the college conference, so that may not be so useful for you. Or, even better, you could have your abstract accepted as an oral presentation, and that's very exciting. Good slides, I think, much like good posters, should be eye-catching, something to draw you in. They should be definitely graphical, not text-based. Nobody wants death by PowerPoint. Not cluttered with nice use of colors, no tiny 0.4 font, and not too many slides with the same boring format. Says he, with many slides with the same boring format, but I hope you forgive me. So, what about when it comes to the day of the presentation? I think people get really, really worried about doing oral presentations, and there's really no need. I think if the worry of many people is that somebody's going to ask a really nasty question, and you're almost untouchable up there because you know your stuff, you've done the work, so you kind of know the details of what you've done, so that's okay. If somebody asks you a question you don't know the answer to that's a reasonable question, then you can just say, well, I don't know, but that's a good question. That happens a lot, and that you lose nothing there. If somebody asks you a really nasty question to try and catch you out, then the only person that comes off badly is them. So there's really nothing to worry about if you get up there to do an oral presentation. In terms of some tips, it's good to have enough notes so that you're comfortable, but try to speak to the audience rather than to read to the audience, because otherwise they'll fall asleep probably. Make sure you have a copy of the slides there in case there are AV issues. I was at IB Week last year in the States, and they had a massive power cut, and all the power went, and the presenters had to carry on somehow, and some did better than others, mainly the ones who had a copy of their slides there. It's actually worth visiting the room that you're going to be presenting in before the talk, and even standing on the podium or where you'll be talking from, just to kind of get your mind in gear for how it's going to look. Practice to colleagues, family, pets, the mirror, whoever will listen, but not too much. Don't overdo it. I think Winston Churchill famously used to learn his talks word for word by talking into the mirror, but I don't think that's really necessary when you know the data inside out, which you will. Make sure you leave some time for questions from the audience. And if you get questions, it's quite good to have a pen and paper handy, because if somebody asks one of these horrible, long-ranging 3-point, 4-point questions, you kind of answer the last bit they said and totally forgot what they said at first. So it's quite useful to take a note of the questions as they come out. Remember, you're the expert, and that's really important. And everyone's nervous when they present, and they should be. You need to channel that energy to drive performance, so to speak. And so after conference, where next? Well, you need to turn that abstract for the conference into a paper of some kind. So which journal do you go for? I think look at the information for authors, focus on the scope of the journal, and what type of article are you going to have? Is it sort of really hardcore basic science, or is it very descriptive data of some kind? And that may affect which journal you're going for. If you're in doubt, contact the journal, because there's real human beings behind the websites who can give you advice. And Brett, I think, would be willing to speak to anyone to give them advice on what may or may not be suitable for healthcare infection. And I think that's probably the first port of call for any abstract that goes into the college conference, would be the Healthcare Infection Journal. But there's others, related journals, depending on what you've done and where you've done it. Journal of Infection Prevention and Journal of Hospital Infection are English. ACIPC and the American Journal of Infection Control are American. And there's lots of other ones out there. So it will really depend on what you've got as to where would be most appropriate to send it. So the peer review process for journals is much like an abstract. The manuscript will be sent to a couple of 3 independent reviewers who may well know who you are. Some journals do blinded review. They'll provide some perspective on the quality of the paper, objectively and subjectively. Reviewers and editors will improve what's submitted, but they won't rewrite a poor paper. So you need to make sure that the paper is good quality at the start. Otherwise, it will just be rejected for being poor quality, not because the science is not good enough for the journal. So peer review is a lottery. It's an imperfect system, but it's sort of the least worst review system that we have so far. Sometimes things go wrong, but in general, I think it works. But I think it's also true to say that really the post-publication peer review is the most important assessment of your paper. How is the professional community going to respond and receive your work? Will it be practice-changing, or will it sort of be lost in the ether? And that's the most important thing. So some very small papers in lowly journals have actually changed practice a lot more than really big papers in big journals. So further information as we draw to a close. Have a look at the college website, which is where you can submit an abstract. Deadline is the middle of August. And the IPS website has also got some useful resources in terms of developing posters and oral presentations, which may be of interest. I stole some slides for this webinar from Professor Heather Loveday with her permission. And so to summarize, I hope it's been a useful meander through the process of taking your ideas through to doing the scientific work, to writing the abstract, to presenting it, and to converting that presentation into a paper. So I hope it's been useful, and I'd be really interested to know if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, John. That was an excellent overview. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and there's been quite a few questions that have come in whilst you're presenting, which you probably haven't had the opportunity to see. And and I've been trying to do some tweaking as well whilst you've been presenting. But one of the first questions that came through is just a question about what is the most common reason, in your view, for abstracts being rejected?
So the absolute top of the tree is either very shaky evidence for improvement or absolutely no evidence for improvement, or no intervention, nothing. They didn't actually do anything. It's just purely descriptive. That's the number one reason. If they're just explaining how, for example, a department is set up without explaining what they did to change it and improve it. So I think there needs to be a distinction between what is an interesting story and what is a piece of science that's going to help colleagues and drive changes in practice. I think the second most common reason for rejection, and I think this is particularly at the bigger conferences, is inappropriate or absolutely no stats. And the idea of stats is that you're taking a difference between some numbers of some kind and you're saying, is this due to chance or not? And I think if it's very likely to be due to chance, then you can't make the conclusions that you might be trying to make. So that can be a reason to reject also.
Great, thanks, John. One of the other things we're starting to see at conferences and conference presentations is people moving away from PowerPoint type presentations and using Prezi. And one of the questions that have come in is, do you have an opinion on the use of Prezi at conferences? Do you think that it's suited to certain presentations more than others? Do you use it yourself?
I have done. I've had a play with Prezi. I think it's probably more fiddly to use and to get to perform and to fire. So I think my view on Prezi and PowerPoint is that a good Prezi is better than a good PowerPoint, but a bad Prezi is worse than a bad PowerPoint. Because if you're just going from text to text to text, you end up feeling a bit seasick and it doesn't really offer anything. So I think to get Prezi to work, you need to really really think about how it's all going to work. What do you think, Brett?
Yeah, I agree. I think that Prezi certainly is suited to certain types of presentations too, particularly those that might be telling more of a story. I think sometimes it's hard with out-and-out pure scientific presentations to use Prezi, but I've certainly seen some people manage to do that and do that well. So I think it has a role. I think that it's also a bit tricky to use to start with, but once you get used to it, like all things, it gets a bit easier.
Yeah, and I think a general point is that we're totally over-dependent on visual aids. What I love to see is a speaker who throws away PowerPoint altogether and just goes old school and talks. And I think you can engage with the audience in a much more direct way, actually, if you throw away the PowerPoint altogether or use it for a few images. And I think there may be a bit of pushback in that direction over the coming years. Have
you done that recently at any conferences yourself?
No, I'm not brave enough, but I will. One day I will.
One other question that's come in is about, and I think this is something that people face quite regularly, particularly when conference abstract submission dates are well in advance sometimes of conferences. And I noticed that some conferences now are getting much better at pushing back the conference submission date to much closer to the conference. So with that in mind, the question is about how acceptable it is to put preliminary results into an abstract, because you know you're going to have the results ready and the findings ready for when the conference comes around, but you're not quite there yet when the abstracts are due. So what's your view on that and how that might best be handled?
So it will depend very much on the project. I think if it's a big piece of work that's obviously well planned and you're presenting it honestly and openly and say, this is where we've got to, this is where we're going to go, what do you think, then I think that's the way to go. I think if you say the results will be presented at the conference and you have nothing in your hand, so to speak, then I don't think you're going to get very far. But if you've got some preliminary results and you can make a story out of those, then I think there's a good chance you get a favourable review.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, those are the questions that I can see that have come through. Steve, I don't know if you've got any others that you can see that you need to direct to me, or whether you want to, John, if you're happy for us to unmute and see whether there are any other questions from the floor that people might have.
Yes, it's Steve here. No, I don't have any other questions, Brett, and I will get in and unmute everybody and have any other questions if people would like. So we'll just go through now and do that. And so if you've got a question, put your hand up if possible, or first in, first best dressed. There's 15 people online at the moment. So I think we've got everybody. So
Silent.
I think it's going to get noisy.
Any questions that people have?
Can everybody hear me? It's Phil here.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks, John. Great presentation. Nice. It makes me want to go and like.
You know what? Sorry, I can't hear you there. Can you just mute everyone and just unmute the one person who's speaking?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go for it.
John, Phil Russo here. Thanks for the presentation. That was really informative. One of the issues that often comes up is what's the right thing to do with regards presenting stuff at a conference and then wanting to put that same stuff into a paper?
A set of that's very standard practice to take a set of data and present it at a conference and present that same data set as a paper. And at the time of submission of the paper, you make a little note and say this was presented in part at such and such conference. And I think journal editors will be absolutely fine with that. And I'm sure Brett would back me up on that. What is frowned upon is taking the same set of data or a very similar set of data and sending it around the world. We'll do one conference in the UK, we'll do one in the States, and we'll do one in Asia and Asia Pac, and hope that nobody notices. That's a little bit naughty. But I think there's valid reasons to want to do that. If you've done a large program of work, then it may be that you can section it off into distinct portions, then that's okay. But I think if you're really trying to use the same data or literally the same abstract, that's not so good.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Just following up on Phil's question, do you think that if the audience is sufficiently different, do you think that then becomes more palatable to present findings? You might have a study that you're presenting to a specific professional group that will be completely different to another group you might present in a different country, for example. Do you think that becomes more palatable then?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you put that decision in the hands of the program committee of that meeting and say, look, we presented this work at such and such conference. We think it would also be relevant here. What do you think? And I think that's absolutely okay, as long as you make that disclosure.
Great. Are there any other questions that people have before we finish up? Doesn't sound like... so just, are there any other questions? Any final questions that people might have?
I think we're done, Brett.
I think we're done.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. I'll hand back to you in a moment, Steve. Just for the people who on behalf of the people who have listened in today, John, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I'm sure everyone's very grateful online to have had the opportunity to listen to you, and we'll I believe, going to put the presentation up on the conference website, but I'm sure Steve will talk to that in a moment. So look, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to meeting you in person one day, maybe in Australia or maybe at an international conference, and look forward to your tweets and blogs as well. So thank you very much on behalf of the college.
All right, thanks, Brett. It's amazing we haven't met yet. We'll have to sort that out.
We will. Thanks, John.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. You probably would get an email from GoToWebinar as a bit of a follow-up survey, but other than that, I'll be probably sending you an email separately asking you about your experience of it. But other than that, thanks again, everybody. Have a great day at work. Look forward to seeing everyone at the conference in November. And I guess we'll let John Otto go to bed because it's what's 1:45 in the morning over there.
It is indeed. Good night, folks.
Okay. Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.